Georgy Georgievich Hmurkin, the author of 4 books and about 40 scientific and journalistic works on the history of Indian mathematics, the legacy of the Rurik family, the biography of Vladimir Lenin, the topic of church-state relations in the first post-revolutionary years. The author of an ancient academic translation from Sanskrit to Russian of excerpts from Mahavira's mathematical essay, collection of the main provisions of the science of computing. Georgy Hmurkin is the senior lecturer of the Moscow Aviation Institute, applicant of the Center for the History of Religion and the Church of the Institute of Russian History, Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow. His presentation is dedicated to the language diversity of the Book of Dzian. Good afternoon, dear participants. My presentation is called On the Linguistic Diversity of the Book of Dzian. The secret doctrine is structured as a detailed commentary and excerpts from the Book of Dzian. We know that. But it is still not quite clear what kind of essay that is, at least by different scientists in the East and in the West have not identified this essay. There are quite a few questions in the scientific society to the essay that HPB created. David Reigel assumed, based on the content of the Book of Dzian and on the excerpt that Elena Blavatsky writes in the secret doctrine. So he assumed that this can be something that belongs to Kalachakra tradition, something from the Kalachakra cycle. But we can also ask on what language the initial text was written, and not only its format, but also the language itself. So now we can see the languages that have been used, that were used for different terms, for different notions in the secret doctrine, in the English version of the secret doctrine. So apart from the words in English, there are also words in Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, as well as a few words in an unknown language, or unknown languages even. We can assume that one of those unknown languages includes Zenzar language, the language that is not included in any scientific classifications, as of yet, as of now. So if we have a look at the English text, at the translation of the Book of Dzian, we will see all of those terms, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, and we will not be able to make any sort of conclusion of what language those texts that were in front of Elena Blavatsky were written on. So those texts were either in front of her or of her mentors, of her teachers that worked together with her creating the secret doctrine. So why is that? There are certain rules, there are certain traditions of translation of Eastern texts. As we know, Buddhism appeared when it appeared there were already some texts existing in Sanskrit. And one of the key definitions of Buddhism is Buddha. That's a Sanskrit word that means awakened, someone that woke up. So when those Sanskrit words were translated into English, to Tibetan, Buddha was translated as Sangye. After that, those terms started to migrate into different countries, such as Mongolia, moving up north. And those Mongolian texts interpreted Sangye, or let's say translated Sangye as Sanje. However, when we turn to the Tibetan text or to the Mongolian text, and then we start translating that into Russian or let's say English, then this term Sangye or Sanje will still be translated as the initial term Buddha. So in the Russian translation we will always find the Sanskrit word. But the language that was initially used for the original will still be clear. So the fact that there are words in many different languages doesn't allow us to say what language that book was written in initially, the book itself. We have a few indications, we have some hints regarding what HPB had access to, what she had on hand. So this is an excerpt from the Secret Doctrine of the first edition, published in 1888, that says that if we translate, if one were to translate into English using only the substantives and technical terms as employed in one of the Tibetan and Senza versions, verse 1 would read as follows. As you can see, Elena Blavatsky here is saying that she can testify that she has access to some version of the Tibetan and Senza versions. It is not quite clear whether that's Tibetan or Senza, or if it's a mixture of the two. And that's what she asks us to consider. And that excerpt includes a certain sequence of words, quite technical terms that are mixed with English particles, conjunctions, and so on. So I would like to go into detail of a few of those sentences. So this is the very beginning of the Book of Dzian. I would also like to mention a few issues that arise while we're working with this type of text. So some Tibetan words that are normally pronounced in the same way can be to be transcribed in a different way. So they are written differently. There are a few different versions of the same word. For example, there is a word klung or lung, which can be spelled like you can see on the left, klung, or alung, as it is on the right. And depending on the spelling, even though the pronunciation is basically the same, it can be translated either as the river or as the wind. So if we only perceive the Tibetan words by ear, so if we only hear them, then we have no single way to transcribe them, to write them down, and that's what causes the complexity of that translation. The second complexity, the second difficulty, lies in the fact that Tibetan words have many different systems of transcription. So there is a large number of systems for writing Tibetan words in Latin letters, such as the examples that you can see on the slide now. There are 2 or 3 or even 4 different versions. If you hear a Tibetan word, then I need to decide what system I'm going to pick. So either whether I'm going to write it by ear. So that's that's quite an important question. And HPB heard. So whether HPB heard those words or whether she was shown those texts, that is quite a significant question. So what we see in the text of the Secret Doctrine is pretty much the reconstruction of the Tibetan text. So we're going to have a look at a few Tibetan words that have to be reconstructed because this is not the traditional system of transcription that was used. So let's have a look at the first sentence. I underlined that in blue. Toag in Jigyu slept 7 kolo. So this is a sentence that contains three clearly Tibetan words. To'ag. To'ag is the first word that we find in the Secret Doctrine. How can we reconstruct this word? I suggest the following version, the following way of reconstructing it. So that can be either tog or tug. In the first case, the word means first, the primordial, the primary, and in the second case, that's something that has a certain duration, something that lasts. So that can be a distance or a duration. So let's say the primordial, the initial distance. And that's how we come to the term of space. And in stanzas itself, these words are rendered as the eternal parent, which also corresponds to the word space. So I think reconstruction here is quite realistic. Then there is another word that we can have a look at. Shi-gu. We can be almost 100% sure that this word can be reconstructed. Shi is a Tibetan word meaning the root of basis, and gu is the matter or substance, something material. So that word can be translated as the root matter or the initial, the primordial matter. In the Sacred Doctrine, this word is translated in an artistic, in a philosophic way, such as you can see on the screen, the ever-invisible robes. So the literary meaning of the word is slightly different from what we can find in the stanzas, because the stanzas are more poetic, more artistic, more philosophic, and the word is rendered differently as a deeper and more profound interpretation that can be found, but it is quite hard. So Elena Blavatsky, when she saw a Tibetan word, following the instructions of her mentor, of her teacher, or according to the knowledge that she received from her teacher, she uses not the traditional translation of the word, but she adds the shade of the meaning, or the meaning itself that was dictated to her by the teacher. And the last word that also can be reconstructed with certainty, kolo, means the circle, the wheel, or the disc, and it is rendered as the eternity. Obviously, those big circles, cosmic circles. So when we put all of these sentences together, we end up having this very vivid, very poetic and artistic text. The eternal parent, wrapped in her ever-invisible robes, had slumbered once again for 7 eternities. Let's take another sentence. The second one. Zotmanas Jiba. The first word is quite difficult to reconstruct because there are no equivalents in the Tibetan language that you can notice right away. But if we consult the Russian translation or the English translation of stanzas, then we can assume that what was meant was te ma ne, or you che ma nas. The first one means the time, the second one is the negative particle, and then the last word, ne, is just a verb meaning to exist. So time was not. Yeah, that's the first part. The first part of that. So the next word is Jiba. That's basically Shiva, taken from Sanskrit. Shiva meaning peace, tranquility. So this word basically got into the Tibetan language and was rendered as to lay asleep. Or maybe we can say doze off or sleep. The next word, olnyug, which can be found in the Tibetan language too, spelled in the exactly same way in the classical transliteration. And this word means to stretch out, something that expands, extends. And it can be translated as duration, and that's what it was translated like. That's how we come to time was not, for it lay asleep in the infinite bosom of duration. So that word bosom is very specific. And we can have a look at the next sentence too, at one more sentence. Kong chog not. Written like that. So this can also be reconstructed. The word that is now mentioned here, is now highlighted here. You can see the Latin rendering and the transliteration that is the most common nowadays. So that word always requires the understanding of what could hide behind it. So that's what reconstruction basically requires us to do. Komchag has a few translations, such as supreme, highest spiritual principle, or the God. And in the Secret Doctrine, this word is translated as the universal mind. So we can also look it up in the dictionary, and we can also see how Elena Blavatsky, or her teacher, translated that word. So those meanings are close, but not exactly the one that we have in the academic literature normally. And another word which is of interest, La Chohan. At least two parts of that word can be reconstructed with certainty. La means divine or sacred or holy. Then Chos, as that can be translated as teaching, or the religion, or the teaching of Buddha, something that has quite a wide meaning. And how do we reconstruct the end of that word is quite an issue. So this Mhan does present quite a problem. There can be few versions. This is my hypothesis. I think that this is just an abbreviation, or let's say the rendering of Mkhan, that can be translated as an expert, someone who is skillful, someone who is knowledgeable in a divine teaching. So that's how the word Chohan can be interpreted. Let's have a look at how it is translated in the Secret Doctrine. So this word corresponds to Dzian Chohan. It's the pronunciation of Elena Roerich, and in stanzas we can find the translation Ahi. What that means, or what language that was written in, is a very is a big question, and there is some correspondence with the Sanskrit language, but it is hard to say for sure what it means and what it can't mean. So I think I'm going to come to an end here. There are quite a few things that we can say here, but I think that the main idea here is clear. Those are words that sound like a code or something that was encrypted. But then we can follow how those words can be reconstructed from the very original to what we have, and then we can follow this correspondence. I don't know why, but we're supposed to see the conclusions now. There you are. So, there are different versions of the Book of Dzian. Madame Blavatsky quoted one of them, and just like we can see from the excerpt in the Secret Doctrine, that excerpt has predominantly Tibetan vocabulary. The word Dzian is also not so easy to translate or to interpret. I assume that the word Dzian can be the initial word, or the key word of the full title of the work, of the treatise. You know, this is an Eastern tradition when there is a work in Sanskrit or in Tibetan, and instead of repeating some title, which can be very long, can be something of the White Lotus, the Buddha's teaching, something very long and very picturesque, something very vivid, can be shortened and abbreviated to something that's much more compact. And I assume that Dzian is one of the key words in some long title of some work. And it can be reconstructed in multiple different ways. For example, the three of them that can be seen on the slide. So, Dzang, wise, sage, learned. Then there is the word Tsang, whole, complete, Brahma, and Ntan, the word that can be translated as knight's name, sign, mark, etc. So perhaps though there is some very long title, the complete teaching about the birth of the worlds, that was abbreviated to the first word, for example, complete. Yeah, the complete teaching could have been abbreviated to complete. And the last conclusion that I would like to mention, there is a large number of terms traditional for Tibetan Buddhism in the Book of Dzian. But the Mahatmas put their own meaning in these terms. They attach their own meanings, and it can be translated in one way, and then by Elena Blavatsky and by her teachers, it could be rendered, it could be interpreted, translated in a different way, adding more dimensions to it. This way, if Tibetologists get access to the Book of Dzian, they will only be able to understand it only superficially, if they don't turn to the theosophical teaching. Thank you. Let's be brief, because we're already a little bit out of the schedule. So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I would like to say that you are completely right, speaking about different interpretations, and the systems were so unstable before, even for different languages, for the Arabic, for the Arabic language too. There were not just 5 ways to write, to spell the word. There can be more and more and more and more. And only at the middle of the 20th century, there was a system that was more or less stable and more or less fixed. So the question is about that word peace or tranquility that we have seen. Thank you for your question. Indeed, there are about 30 systems of transliteration in science. So the same word, the same Tibetan word, can be transcribed in 30 different ways. And closer to the end of the 20th century, we finally got to establish a more or less fixed system of transliteration. As for Shiva, that you ask your question about, so Shiva has many faces, just like other Indian gods, Hindu gods. The same god can be the creator, and the destructor, so they can be good and bad. And I think Shiva has one of its initial meanings, and that meaning is that peace, goodness. There is also a wish where people wish you Shiva, that means that they wish you prosperity and health and happiness, something very positive and very good. And that's how those attributes, the word acquired, and that's how we received that word, and that's how we ended up having that meaning that I was mentioning. Thank you. So when we speak about attributes that you have just presented, this is the external information that can be discussed, and so on and so on. And once we are in the understanding of the sources, then we can realize that the peace and tranquility comes only after the destruction of something, when something has been destroyed, Shiva cannot remain in that state of goodness, a state of sainthood, without destroying. The theosophical interpretation is that something is destroyed, and then that state of bliss, if you like, the state of goodness comes. Yes, we can interpret words in different ways. Just like you asked, you said, okay, Shiva is destructive, why is he in this goodness? So theosophy can explain everything, everything. Even when Shiva is in the state of goodness, that comes after the creation and the destruction.
I will be very short indeed. I just would like to say a couple of words. There is lots of Tibetan terminology. And we do understand that this is the Tibetan text. I would like to say a couple of words about the translation. About the translation of the name, the Book of Dzian. The main meaning is that Dzian is translated as Tibet. You know, there is the book, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It can simply be called as a Tibetan book. The terms that we've looked at today have decipherment, they have astronomical meaning. Yes, this is correct. The Book of the Dead. Where is the dead and where is the living? Which plane are we talking about? This is the quality of space, the quality of the cycles. And HPB was asked if there is time without space. And she had an answer to that question. And then she was asked whether space can exist without time. And she said yes.